Thanks for everyone for coming. So as you all know, it's Professor David Betz, and he's a professor of war in the modern world at King's College London. Wrote a book called Carnage Connectivity, and also recently has you've kind of blown up across the internet with your comments about the threat of or the risk of civil war in the UK, which often is the thing we hear about in sort of Twitter world, but they actually have an academic backing it up with theory and data. Talking about it is been quite refreshing and I think quite terrifying for some people at the same time. But we're here today to give you an opportunity just to speak to us about that. And so welcome, first of all. And if you want to just talk for as long as you want, really. I mean, the format here is pretty open-ended. It's a case of if you... Coming, guys, yeah. See. I think that if you want to give some opening statements and have a dialogue, or if you just want to talk and for a while and then we can discuss at the end, I don't really mind. What would you prefer?
Let's go for an open-ended discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Professor David Betz, take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction and for the kind words. I'd have to admit that I'm not a public figure. I haven't been a public figure until recently. I'm basically a fairly standard professor of war studies, if there can be a standard professor of war studies. And so the recent surge of interest in what I've been saying, I think, frankly, and not to be too modest about it, has very little to do with my original insight and the fact that instead what I am saying in a particular way is not actually academically exciting in the sense of being controversial. I haven't created a new theory. I'm not introducing new data that isn't already in the public sphere. What I think I've done is simply articulate in a structured manner something that very large numbers of people already feel, already apprehend, and they have thought, perhaps, am I crazy? Am I seeing something that other people do not see? Am I upset about something that I ought not to be upset about? Am I unusual? And what has occurred is, I think, a fairly large simultaneous public realization that they are not crazy and that they are not out of line in being upset at what is occurring to them. So fundamentally, my thesis is that all of the factors which scholars would generally accept as being indicative of the possibility of civil wars occurring are present in contemporary Europe in a very ideal manner. It isn't simply the UK, although the UK is a very prominent case of this. It is effectively all of Western Europe, and certainly it affects the big three in Europe, by which I mean the UK, France, and Germany, more or less equally. I will probably talk mostly about the UK case because I am a British citizen. I live there. I'm familiar with that language and embedded in that community. So I tend to know that better than the other cases. But I know the other cases sufficiently well to believe that the conditions are not altogether different. For related reasons, the United States is also in this category of civil war potentiality, but and we can go into this if you wish. I think that the American case has again a somewhat different character, and so we probably should not too much generalize what I'm about to say, which is mostly focused, it must be said, on Western Europe and particularly on perhaps particularly on the UK as an example. So coming to what I've said are the factors, the indicative factors. In no particular order, they are these. Firstly, factionalism, in particularly what is called polar factionalism, which is a kind of factionalism which you get when you have passed beyond issue factionalism. So when people are arguing over particular issues that are contentious in in any given society. Think of things like the death penalty or access to abortion or involvement in foreign wars or something like that, where people are arguing over the specific issue, but still see themselves to be part of the same, essentially, political community. That is issue factionalism. And issue factionalism is more or less normal in a society because people differ on these issues, and we have mechanisms for resolving those differences and having a discussion. Polar factionalism is a kind of factionalism where people are no longer arguing principally over the issue per se. What they're doing is they're looking to their tribe, to their community, for signals as to what their community believes. And then they adopt that view. This is a kind of factionalism you get when people are feeling insecure. Right? They feel insecure because the normally functioning mechanisms for resolving contentious debates are no longer normally functioning. Which is why we see in cases of polar factionalism, strange cases where people have radically changed their views from recent times, from the recent past to now, where you see, well, why has this person or this group flip-flopped on a particular issue? And usually, that can sometimes be explained through polar factionalization. We are now in a period of polar factionalization. The most obvious, the most important aspect of this now is the emergence of avowedly ethnic political parties, which represent essentially ethnic or sectarian causes to the virtual exclusion of any other causes. In the case of the UK, for example, this would be exemplified by the 5 nominally independent Muslim MPs who, for all intents and purposes, are elected on a Gaza mandate. The second indicative factor, which is terribly important and might go first, actually, but it is related to the first one, and that is the perception of status loss by a formerly dominant majority in society, what in the literature is referred to as downgrading, or sometimes as displacement, or in the popular discourse as replacement. And effectively, what happens in this case is that you're on what is the case now throughout Western Europe is that on current trajectory, the indigenous people of Europe will be a minority in their own lands by the middle of the 21st century, or perhaps a little bit later. I say the middle of the 21st century because the important thing is not actually the overall number. The more important factor is the youth number. And that is very close already to a tipping point in most places. Which people recognize and powers their sense of urgency about the situation. Now, I think there's an interesting bit of neurolinguistic programming that is going on here. I didn't notice it in this specific audience, but in others, one does with great regularity. And you observe it in that statement when I used the words indigenous people of Europe, which causes people, a lot of normal people, to raise an eyebrow, to feel a bit of discomfort, as in, can you use those words, right? Are not the words indigenous peoples reserved for other people of the planet besides those of Europe, specifically white people? And that's happened because Western culture is one that has been propagandized over 2 generations now into an instinctive self-abnegation that no other people in the world subject themselves to. No Chinese audience would react in this way. No Indonesian audience would react this way. No Japanese audience would react this way. But Western European peoples do react that way, even when intellectually you know there is no reason why you ought to. That is essentially a reflex action which is inculcated in people over a lifetime of propagandization, is the proper word for what has happened to you, what has happened to your minds. The third factor is a loss of faith in avenues of peaceful change. And that arises from what I've just said, right? From the realization that all of this is happening because, not by accident, but by choice, specifically by elite choice over many years, which has created the policies that have enabled this situation, almost always in defiance of popular opinion. To give an example again from the British case, if you were to look at the election manifesto, post-1945 election manifestos of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in the UK, specifically doing a textual analysis of their statements around the issue of migration, you'll see that this topic, that consistently, no party has said, well, we are going to have uncontrolled mass migration. Mostly what they have said is that we are going to manage migration. Sometimes what they have said very explicitly is, dear voters, we understand your concerns about migration. We're not going to do that to you. We are not going to actively change the demographic of the country. The reality, of course, is that they did exactly that. And up until recently, they said one thing and did another. In the UK case with the Blair government, they more or less came out into the open and said, as a part of their national transformative political agenda, they were going to use migration to change the country. Or as it was put by one of Tony Blair's speechwriters very deliberately, they were going to use diversity to rub the right's noses in the dirt and to defeat all of their arguments, essentially by changing the population demographic of the country. And we're very open about this. The truth of the matter, as is quite obvious, people do not want this, right? This is not a popular political position, and there is an increasingly strong, and as a result of this disjuncture between what people are promised politically and what they receive, in actuality, there is an increasingly strong and measured perception that normal politics does not function effectively as a solution to collective action problems anymore, because the trust has dropped out. But politics, as a basic definition of politics, is the way in which human beings in groups solve collective action problems, i.e. things that we can't do individually, we organize in groups to achieve in a collective manner. Politics is essentially about that. It's finding these collective action problems and organizing people to solve them in a kind of rule-based and systematic manner. When politics ceases to be able to solve collective action problems, it doesn't mean that collective action problems don't exist, that they disappear, or that people's wish that problems be solved is not something which they attempt to do in another manner. That other manner, frankly, is in worst cases, and we are now tending to this, through violence, through direct action. Through going beyond the law in some form, which may include varying types of violence. There has also been a profound collapse of trust in all institutions, but especially in political institutions. This is not a matter of debate. This has been trust is something which has been very systematically, very widely studied throughout effectively the whole of the world, but particularly in the developed world since at least the end of the Second World War. And there's no dispute that in terms of its trajectory, trust is in decline and has been for a very, very long time. It affects all institutions, but not all of them equally. Historically speaking, politicians have been in the lead in terms of in terms of distrust, but other institutions like journalists, it must be said, are pretty close, lawyers and the like. On the other end of the scale, people have tended to trust police, military, the clergy, doctors, and so on. But even there, the decline is very evident. People trust police less than they did, clergy less than they did, so on, less than they once did. Very worryingly, moreover, the recent collapse in trust of police is very marked. So we have this profound collapse of trust in all institutions in society, but especially in political institutions. My suggestion is that when you hear the word trust, you might very reasonably replace it with the term social capital. Social capital is a kind of core concept of contemporary sociology. It is essentially to a functioning society what money is to a functioning economy. You need social capital for things to occur, socially, to move ideas around, to get around differences between people and groups in a society. You need this kind of, well, trust effectively is what we're talking about. Social capital, in other words, is in free fall throughout the Western world. It has been diminishing for at least a generation, but it's now rapidly diminishing by many measures. And if you accept the analogy of social capital being to a functioning society what economic capital is to a functioning, or what financial capital is to a functioning economy, then you may accept that I would argue we are on the verge of a kind of social bankruptcy. The main difference between the West and places of the world that you might consider to be more prone to civil war in recent, not just decades, in recent centuries, in fact, is that the West has been relatively rich for about 2 or 2.5 centuries relative to every other place on the planet. On top of that, the West has in more or less the same time, but particularly I think I would suggest peaking in the early 20th century, had a culture of obedience, which was based on a relatively strong ability to achieve consensus within Western societies. And it has usually had a unified and competent elite. All things being equal, these factors normally provide a strong bulwark against the outbreak of civil wars. If you have a lot of wealth, if you have a lot of money, then you can paper over cracks in your society. If people are angry with each other and don't want to associate, you can mollify people quite a lot if you have the money to basically keep them materially satisfied. If you can keep the streets clean, if you can pay for enough policemen, if you can pay for, all of the appurtenances of kind of people's expectations of what modern life is. So if that's breaking down, then you have less wherewithal to paper over those cracks than you once did. That culture of obedience is one that is also breaking down. It has, frankly, largely broken down to my mind. There are various causes for this, but a significant one is the very diminished ability of heterogeneous societies relative to homogeneous societies to achieve consensus viewpoints. Homogeneous societies are generally relatively able to achieve consensus decisions, even on very contentious issues, like in times of economic tribulation or external or internal threat, natural disaster, and so on and so forth. If you have a homogeneous society, you're generally much better able to draw on people's willingness to sacrifice collectively. than is the case in heterogeneous, in very mixed societies. Finally, I don't think it's very controversial to suggest that our existing elite is not terribly competent. Right? We have a generalized, in fact, I would suggest there is a generalized competency crisis that is observable across a range of factors, but particularly in political institutions and associated institutions, law, but also just bureaucratic civil administration in general. States are quite clearly over-complexified. They find it more and more difficult to do and more expensive to do things which they once did with considerably greater ease and effectiveness. And that is fundamentally, I would suggest, a reflection of elite incompetence. Secondly, it's also not a unified elite. Generally, in the past, again, looking at the UK as an example, as many people will have observed, the UK relative to its neighbors is relatively less civil war prone, less revolution prone. Right? People often contrast the British with the French, for example. The French being, you might say things like, well, the French are more passionate, they're more likely to go out on the street and break things, and than would British people. There is something to this view, but I think the really important thing about the British scene is that the British elite has generally been very unified. When they've been faced with internal challenges, they've avoided elite defections. And that ability to stay unified in the face of threat has given the British political scene, is one of the reasons why the British political scene over at least 2 centuries now has been stable, relatively stable compared to its neighbors. That's also breaking down. So we can see elite defections both at the high level. Now, admittedly, this is more obvious in the American case, with Trump being the exemplary figure of an elite defection, but you're seeing the same kind of thing beginning to emerge across Western states. You're also beginning to see at the bottom level elite defection, where the word defection is a bit misleading, because in fact what it is not defection per se, but a failure of aspiring elite youth to achieve their ambition in the elite system. Because there are more people expecting to rise to elite positions, elite status, both social status and material status in society, than the elite structure can absorb. A really good example of that, and again in the case of the UK, was the announcement a couple of months ago that last year the number of graduate jobs available in the country had declined by 39% in 1 year. Where are those 39%? Right? Where are those people going to go? If they're not going into the elite, which is the normal absorption pattern for ambitious, aspiring people who've been trained and educated and acculturated to think they are elite, where are they going to go? We'll get to that in a moment, but I think the answer is fairly obvious. In short, the problem is that all of these things are breaking down. Productivity and innovation are flat, as are real wages. I'm not an economist, but this is, again, not a controversial statement. Economies are over-complexified and bureaucratized in, frankly, rather Soviet manner. Debt is gigantic and unsustainable. Heavy and energy-intense industries are increasingly moribund because they can't afford. They're economically uncompetitive in a global marketplace. Moreover, I think that artificial intelligence has the potential to do in the next few years to what the white-collar professions, what has already happened to the blue-collar ones over the last generation, i.e. to replace a bunch of people. The culture of obedience based on consensus building is collapsing under the assault of multiculturalism and identity politics that have destroyed that robust sense of a collective we. And that is a long-term process, I would say, that is aggravated in recent times by the fracturing and isolating effects of social media. The bottom line is that the political system is no longer based on a coherent pre-political loyalty, which means, therefore, that it is basically a castle built on sand. Finally, as I said, the elite is also beginning to fracture and see defections. I've spoken about that already, but I'll just conclude on the point of the emergence of significant expectation gaps. An expectation gap is a bit of jargon from the literature on contentious politics and the theories on why men rebel, and for example, which refers to a situation where people expect one thing usually in terms of their material circumstances, their material prospects, for employment, for procreation, to own a home, basic things like to enter into a good profession, things like that. So when there is a large gap between their expectation, what they think they've been promised, and what they actually receive. Okay. Academics debate everything, and undoubtedly there is debate around on the edges of this. But I think it's fair to say the textbooks all agree that the emergence of expectation gaps are really, really dangerous. They produce dangerous situations. Now I'll conclude this point anyway. Is that probably on an individual level, you might now be thinking that things still seem pretty normal in your daily life. That what I'm saying does not conform totally with your personal experience. Although I have noted a number of young people nodding away pretty furiously when I talked about expectation gap and home ownership and employment and all of the other things, while some of the older people in the room are maybe a little sheepish. Okay, but the thing is that what you are experiencing is normalcy bias. That is that the situation is in fact measurably very tenuous. It would be good to have a discussion, I would suggest, with some of your Balkan friends, if you have any Balkan friends, about prelapsarian Yugoslavia and how quickly that country went from mostly normal to complete bedlam, because that is your situation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I had a few, but what?
Well, thank you, Professor. You just talked about the Balkan, but my question was really about the closest precedent in your research, in your opinion. So both in terms of similar events in history, in the West especially, or closest in proximity in time. Is it, I don't know, the beginning of the 19th century New York City, or is it the Visigoths sweeping over the Gaul and then Spain? I don't know. So migration fueled unrest in the West.
This is a good question, and I'm a bit reluctant to take the argument by example or argument by comparison too far and too literally in this case, and that is for two reasons. Firstly, it's a cardinal rule in the study of insurgency, and ought to be in the study of civil war, and well, it is in the study of civil war, that they're all sui generis. It's all unique, right? Right. When you really ought not to overgeneralize, because it's enormously important with any given one to understand what is the specific context. It's one of the most irritating things that academics do when they're in practical environments, is they talk about, they talk about theory and generalized examples without sufficient regard for the specifics of the matter. So I'm very that is something that weighs on my mind a lot. I don't want to overgeneralize. I think we can use historical example to illuminate aspects of what may be happening. We certainly use historical example to generate models of and theories around things. I personally haven't invented a new model. This is all basically pretty much standard Civil War causational literature. But I do want to stress that we ought not to generalize. We can talk about these causes, as I've just mentioned, and I think the field is not going to argue too much about those. But in any specific case, we need to be very specific, very particular. The second thing is, I don't think that the current case actually is precedented in some really important respects. Some of those are pretty obvious, and everybody's going to nod when I point to social media. I've already pointed at that. The general connectedness of society is different than it had been in the past. We've always been connected, but we haven't been connected in quite this manner, with the ability to move ideas around and for ideas to expand, to multiply in scale and in virality in the way that they do now. Also, a key difference, though, and so most of that is obvious, I'm sure, to everyone. So I won't go on with it. I think it's boring. But I was going to mention a key. Maybe I'll finish the key point and then I'll come. The key one is this: is that within the Civil War's literature, there's a recognition. If you imagine a bell curve, right? Everyone knows what a bell curve is. And on one end of this curve, you have stable democracies. And on the other end of the curve, you have stable autocracies or totalitarian, that, and the curve represents the propensity to civil war or into internal conflict. In stable democracies, you don't have a large propensity to civil war because they're good at solving problems, right? A stable democracy, by definition, is one that has a good, well-developed social habit of solving collective action problems. And people, basically get along with each other even when policy doesn't go in the direction that they would wish, perhaps personally. Over on the stable autocracy bit, you don't tend to get civil war because the state is very good at detecting dissidents and punishing them. Either hiding them away or punishing them publicly to scare people into not following that pattern. The bit in the middle, i.e. the transitional bit, which is neither democratic nor fully autocratic, is where you get the potential for civil war is greater because they don't have either of those sets of tools. So the literature is very clear on that transitional states are ones that are more civil war prone than non-transitional states. That's not really controversial. But most of the literature on transitional states is, in fact, all of the literature, I dare say, on transitional states is concerned with states that are moving from autocratic forms of politics to democratic ones. And so, you might say, if we would be having this conversation in this room in 1992, we might have been saying, okay, Hungary is a country which possesses certain political challenges that arise from the fact that it's just spent the last 45 years under a non-democratic governance. So there's a whole bureaucracy that doesn't really know how to operate in a democratic environment. They have police that have to learn how to, police in a consensual manner and so on and so forth. So that was a case of transition to a more democratic form. I would suggest now the issue is that we're transitioning from democratic forms of governments to totalitarian forms of governments. These are transitional states. Effectively, the UK is a transitional state in terms of its place within the literature on political science, on comparative political science. The UK is transitioning from a relatively free state. So no, that's being a disservice to the UK. From a free state to a relatively unfree one. And that, I don't know how much that difference matters in terms of where you are on the bell curve. It means you're in the middle of the bell curve. But I think there are aspects of that arise from the contrary direction of travel that are important to consider when we say, oh, well, transitional states are examples of civil war prone states that we should bear in mind, because the direction of travel is different. Sorry, that's my last point.
Well, thank you very much. I kind of have three questions. To push back a little bit, just be a bit of devil's advocate in some of the framing, as I'm myself grew up in Britain, and one is a lot of the stuff we're talking about loss of status, and indeed a lot of the strange policing we're having, so-called woke policing and so on. I wonder how much of that is time limited, to the extent the last 7 or 8 years we've been living in a culture that has been culturally colonized by America's moral panics through social media. And so we've adopted the rhetoric, the framing of the Americans. And I've even noticed some of our more popular sort of political influences, left and right, have adopted the vernacular of Americans, even though the manner in which they speak is American. For instance, even the flag movement recently in the UK, the thing I find odd about it is simply that it was such an American thing to do, start flying flags. Because in Britain, we were never really, and this is not a political point, left or right, it always seemed a bit crass to fly a flag for anything other than the Queen's coronation or something, or a jubilee. But it was you didn't see the flag coming out as a political statement like you see in the Americans. And when I see this, I see it as less a cure for things and more a symptom of how strange things have got. Namely, that we're just being culturally colonized by American sensibility. That's one thought. So I wonder how much the problems we're facing right now, the loss of status and so on, of the majority is just us being colonized by America's woke Puritan. Americans love to have periods of Puritan mania every now and again, and I think we're being infected by it. I put that as a proposition to be for your thoughts on that. Secondly, I'm wondering what your thoughts are around the role of Brexit in everything, because you talk about this shift from issue factionalism to polar factionalism. And Brexit was the first time, I remember when Brexit happened, in the months after that, it was the first time I'd ever be able to look at someone in the UK, not according to class. Usually you can tell with the UK class distinctions based on how people dress and so on. But suddenly I could tell what someone believed on a political issue based on what car they drove or what their facial hair was. It was very interesting. It wasn't always correct, but generally I saw a division that I hadn't seen before. And that seemed to be a shift to polar. And my point there is not about whether Brexit's good or bad, but the phenomenon of Brexit, was it a transitional experience, the issue to polar factionalism? The third question I have for you is to do with precisely this shift from issue to polar factionalism, because you could argue maybe, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that the opposite is also true, that if you look back to the 20th century, far more people were members of political parties. I just looked it up, and in 1953, the Conservative Party membership was 2.8 million. Now it's 123,000. Labour was 1 million in 1953. Now it's 360,000. And so what we've seen is, far from people becoming more polarized, we used to have a far more polarized political party structure. We had Labour clubs, Conservative clubs you drink at. That was your community. But now it seems what we then went through is a period of several decades of purely issue-based politics. All the parties kind of agreed on a lot of the major issues, which is what the backlash has come to. So I'm wondering, is the problem that we are now polarizing, or is the problem was that for a period we stopped being polarized over fundamental issues? We thought all the existential questions had been solved, and therefore it was just technocratic fiddling with the details, tightening a few nuts and bolts. So my pushback on that would be, the polarization we're seeing, is it the exception proving the rule of issue-based normality, or was the issue-based period the exception and we're returning to something more normal?
Okay, there's a lot there. I'm not sure I can get to it all, but I'll give it a try, actually. So I fully agree that there is as already mentioned that there is an aspect of the connectedness of our kind of human situation now that is a very important explanatory element of this. And I also think that it's undoubted that certain aspects of American politics and American culture, which relate to the American scene and particularly its racial and political history, have been exported essentially, and so it's no, and an obvious example of this is the BLM movement and the reaction to George Floyd in the United States, touching off rioting not just throughout the United States but also in Europe. In one of the most heavily recorded scenes, you had protests in Bristol, which culminated with the pitching of one of the kind of city fathers of Bristol having his statue pitched into the harbour. Now, I'm the sort of person who thinks that that kind of scene is actually terrifically important. That isn't a bit of normal politics or even just contentious politics. That's a scene of icon destruction. And icon destruction is what happens in deeply factionalized societies, whereas in fact what you're attacking is the collective countenance of your enemy. When you go out and you start knocking down statues and symbols, that's not incidental. That is a very think of it in terms of attacks. That's a very subtle knife. Because it's probing into some very very important parts of the body. It's not a club. It's subtle, but it's very, very, very powerful. So I agree that has moved over. With respect to the flag, like you, I'm an immigrant. I immigrated to Britain. I've lived in Britain for over 25 years now. I consider myself to be British, but the fact of the matter is, I still am perplexed by certain aspects of that. The flag is one of them. In fact, so I'm originally Canadian. Canadians have the conceit of thinking that they understand everyone because they're sort of intermediate between Europeans and Americans. Truth is that Canadians barely understand themselves. But at any rate, there is this conceit, and their observation, for example, that the Americans would fly flags all the time. Every middle-class American household has a flag or two on it. Every a red-blooded American male has an American flag bumper sticker on his pickup truck. Okay, this kind of cliche, and Canadians do that about half as much as Americans do it, and Europeans do it about half as much as Canadians do it. So overt. I think it's true that actually British culture, certainly when I first moved there 25 years ago, was not an overt flag waving culture, and my feeling was, or at least how it explained to me, is people felt actually quite confident about themselves. They felt quite confident about their flag, about their country, about who they were, and they thought they saw the kind of overt American style flag waving as being a bit crass, but also a bit unnecessary. Do you really need to look at us? Do I need to wave the flag all around? I'm sitting in a 200-year-old house. I'm in the shadow of the Mother of Parliaments. Do I need to go around shoving my superior, flag in people's faces in an overt way? Like when you're really confident in yourself, then you don't need these kinds of displays. Now, coming to today, quite obviously, that is not the Sorry, actually, before I come to today, I would say even there, though, there was something very curious. I would notice this. So people would a British person would very unlikely to fly a Union flag off their house, or the St. George's Cross off their house, unless it's World Cup time, in which case then it's okay. But on a normal basis, they would not do so. On the other hand, go into Tesco and get yourself a prepackaged, not Tesco, go into Morrison's and get yourself a prepackaged tuna sandwich, and it's emblazoned with the Union flag. You ever notice this? How many British products are basically wrapped in the British in the flag? The British flag is not invisible in British society. It's often not literally flying look across the on a very large flagpole in the highest point of the city, but it's all over the place. You can't you couldn't mistake it. So I think one could maybe interpret or exaggerate a difference. I don't think there's something congenitally different about Britons and Canadians and Americans. In fact, they all kind of arise from the same cultural space. Coming to today, there are flags all over the country. This is the issue amongst the issues of the day. In my own street, in the last week, has been flagged. Before I got on my plane to come here, I walked up and down the street on the normal route I would walk my dog, and I counted 160 flags. Right, I don't have a fast-moving dog. He's a very old dog. I don't go very far, so that's like a high density. If you think the average dog walk, and you see 160 flags, I think that's a pretty high intensity. I'm not saying that's a scientific measure, but it is a kind of measure. And clearly, also, this is contentious, right? If you're involved in the British cultural space at this moment, you'll have heard the term flag shagging or flag shagger, right? Previously, it was gammon, right? These are disparaging. These are a disparaging description of the people who are quite obviously involved in this effort, who want to fly their flag. Why? I would suggest because they don't feel confident. They don't feel confident that this is their place. They don't feel confident that everyone around them understands, that this is a great country. It is a great shared accomplishment. It is a country which is and ought to be proud of themselves. This is an expression of insecurity, and both on a kind of a somewhat generic level, but also on a neighborhood level. Because when you flag your street, as we know from Northern Ireland, this is also about marking boundaries. There are parts of the town that I live in, which is a medium-sized English town, where you will find no flags. And no person would certainly go into that neighborhood with the intention of putting a flag on a lamppost, because they'd probably get, they would be attacked. The flag would, at any rate, the flag would come down. So you're getting territory marking at a neighborhood behavior, at a neighborhood level. Suffice to say, in short, this is not a sign. This is not a sign of good social health. This is a sign of many aspects of ill social health, of fear, and of the perception of the need to mark one's own tribal territory. Thirdly, you didn't mention it, but it has to be mentioned: the rape gangs. The rape gangs in the UK have transformed the social space. Somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million girls have been raped by primarily Pakistani origin gangs. It can only be this is clan networks, essentially, if I understand it correctly. But at any rate, the scale and the egregiousness is off the scale. It's multi-generational, and it is networked across the country, which says to people who up until this point, who have been thinking, well, maybe the multicultural model is like, underneath we're all the same, right? Of course, that maybe being replaced in your own country is not a very safe thing to occur. If this is what is happening already before that has happened, what should you expect when you have become the minority? Of course, it's impolitic to say. And it isn't, on the whole, a thing raised in polite company, in elite circles. But on the other hand, why would it be? Because it's not elites who are suffering in this manner. It is almost exclusively white working class girls who, frankly, have been pitched on the bonfire of multiculturalism. They've been sacrificed to this, and it's still going on. Finally, and you mentioned Brexit, but and its importance, and I'll explain that. I will speak on that in a sense, but I think already what we can see across a range of organized social activities in British society and other societies are where we can see the divisions emerging and becoming very, very concrete, or very distinct. Okay. So one of those came out of the Brexit debate, but it basically comes up very, very frequently. And it's these two ideas. One is, we want our country back. Okay? You've heard this phrase, or some variation on the phrase, we want our country back. In the case of the Brexit campaign, the most powerful message of the Leave campaign was the take back control. Okay? Above all the messages, the many messages that were going out, that was the one that resonated. Take back control is another, I would suggest, is just semantically, it's basically, we want our country back. We want it's not all that complicated. On the other hand, you had the Remain campaign, and generally speaking, the entirety of our power elite, the political establishment, most of media, nearly all of academia, say, well, why? What are countries for anyway? Like, countries are old, like, this isn't the way that people organize themselves anymore. Countries are kind of this anachronistic institution, because nowadays what we have are these supranational organizations, some of which are very obvious in the form of the EU, but others which are not very obvious, but really terribly important in terms of like how your country functions, what your standards are for a range of things, how your money moves around, all of that sort of. So you get these two arguments saying we want our country back, and the other saying, like, forget it. Countries are over. We're now organizing ourselves in a different pattern, which incidentally is one which cannot be democratic. And we can go into why that is the case, but the main thing being is that there's no unified demos to check on its public will. So Brexit concentrated a lot of that. In more recent times, every week there is a new event which presents that kind of division. One of the ones that you might have observed, because it was a big public event, was the Glastonbury Music Festival. The Glastonbury Music Festival, you have a music artist. I'd never heard of the guy before, and I've honestly forgotten his name now. It doesn't matter. But, he was saying, what was it? You want your country back. You want your country back. Shut the fuck up. Okay? So, very simply, if you want to get a measure of like where the line is and who is on what side of it, get a group of average people in the room and say, which of in that door is the we want our country back door, proceed there, and that door is the shut the fuck up door, okay? You're going to get, now, and I think what happens in a polarized society is you get almost everybody split to one of those doors, okay? And that's the situation. That's the situation we're that's the situation we're in now. Finally, on political parties, yes, I think that's a very good point with respect to the decline of mass political parties. I think that that's a reflection, though, of, or in the past, that's a reflection, though, of the existence of a more coherent political framework. And that where we are now, we don't have mass parties. We have a proliferation of parties instead. But most of those, in fact, are not parties. What they are is movements. Right? They're issue movements. So and a good example of that is UKIP in the UK. UKIP is, yes, it is a political party, but essentially it was an issue movement for a long time, and fundamentally still is. I think probably Reform, which is not now is a competitor of UKIP, frankly, but obviously kind of leading, much more significant kind of successor to it. I guess one could say. I think it's more of a movement than a party. It's not actually legally a party, I'm given to understand. It's got a rather more complicated management structure, and I'm skeptical of its. I'm honestly skeptical of its potential. But I think I take your point. But I think that's a reflection of the mass political party was a reflection of a society that had a more coherent political framework, and the mass parties were able to provide an umbrella for quite a large range of political ideas, both within the on the conservative and the Labour side. Whereas now they're all fracturing. And the mass political parties are, in fact, are very, very diminished in terms of membership.
Thank you. Lisa, you had a question.
Yep. I think he was... Yeah, more trying Litzwick. And I'm just, firstly, regarding the flag issue, I'm not sure if talking about the American elements of this has much explanatory power, considering the activities of British identifying populations in Ireland throughout the 20th century and how fond they are of using the flag to mark their territory. It seems to be more a bit of a conflict thing. But on that issue, do you honestly think that Western European countries, especially the United Kingdom, actually have the capacity for a civil war nowadays? Considering if we look at Troubles in Northern Ireland, probably the most equivalent example, it never got beyond terror campaigns, bombings, mass casualty events due to a limitation of capacity within those groups, as well as the power of the security state there. And arguably the two populations there, the two relatively indigenous European populations there, were highly integrated with one another. The communities were very strong. Compared to nowadays, a lot of people are split up. And there's a huge amount of atomizations within major European populations in their own countries, meaning that their actual capacity for organized violence seems to be far, far lower. And not to mention the movement within Europe to largely disarm populations. In Ireland, you had a history of armed struggle that involves, both legally and illegally obtained firearms that were gathered over decades. If you compare that to the UK now, the UK has relatively low firearm ownership, and those firearms are relatively weak compared to what would be usually used by law enforcement or militaries. So how would these populations in any reasonable way conduct any sort of civil war?
Okay, so to the first part of your answer, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think there was the potential for it to metastasize into what everyone will understand and no one would dispute is a civil war. But I'll now explain in reference to your follow-on questions why I think that is the case. Before I do, though, I should stipulate that civil war is a term that it has the potential to encompass a very wide range of contingencies. I said earlier that they're all unique. They all have their specific contexts, and I don't expect that. And that is the case in the UK, and will be the case in France, and will be the case in Germany and other places where this might well occur. I don't expect that it is going to look like the American Civil War circa 1860, because the context is different, and I don't expect. I don't expect that it is going to look like the Taiping Rebellion of roughly the same time, because the context is different. But I think we will have no trouble referring to events as they transpire as a civil war, because it will be an armed conflict conducted by belligerents who, at the beginning of the conflict, were under the same sovereign authority, which is a basic definition of civil war. I think in the 21st century, Western, formerly robustly democratic context, what we should expect, firstly, is something which is akin to what usually is called dirty war, which is a descriptor that's usually was coined to apply to Latin American style internal conflict. Long-term, chronic, characterized by assassinations, kidnappings, punishment beatings, and state or other group reprisals, taking the form of disappearances, and essentially death squads, counter-assassinations. These, as I said, tended to be chronic. They tended to be low level in violence, in the sense that you don't have two armies, one painted blue and one painted gray, going at each other, fighting each other with high-grade military weapons. But you do get a lot of violence, and deranging violence. So, for example, you might, if you were, say, in Guatemala, in the late 1980s, it wouldn't have been, and you were catching a bus to go to school or work, it wouldn't have been completely unusual to get on the bus and find two decapitated heads on the floor of the bus, which were there as essentially as a demonstration. Right, that kind of violence is typical of dirty wars. You can come up with various other imaginations. Think of Mexico, for example, with bodies dangling from overpasses and that sort of situation. So I think here, in the first instance, you will have the emergence of a dirty war, which will have a lot of resemblance, frankly, to what occurred in Northern Ireland, which also sometimes is referred to as having been a dirty war of this type, conducted by terrorism, paramilitaries, and the like. So, just to be perfectly clear, by my definition, Northern Ireland is an instance of civil war. It was localized within the larger political entity, which is Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the British state had the wherewithal to more or less contain it, although the reason that the British urban landscape began to change in the 1980s through the 1990s was because they couldn't fully contain the violence to Northern Ireland. But in my conception, that's part of it, and one should expect that. This phase, though, of dirty war is like it may precede or more likely will proceed in parallel with another form of civil war, which one might refer to as Balkanization, or maybe in a more British context of Ulsterization. It's a little awkward to use that term because it specifically refers to police changes in Ulster, but in this case I use it to kind of point a spotlight at the local factionalization which occurred. And in this essentially intertribal conflict fundamentally between natives and non-natives, although there will be fracturing within both those categories. So the first dirty war is basically elite, post-national elite versus the street, the blob versus the street, okay? Put it that way. Or the we want our country back versus why, or, you get it. So dirty war is essentially within the state and directed primarily at punishing the power elite for having done what it has done. The intertribal conflict is much larger and will be much more strenuous, but also largely, I think, conducted by paramilitaries. It's not going to metastasize into an American-style mid-19th century American Civil War for lots of completely obvious reasons, one of which you just mentioned with respect to the availability of arms. But a more important reason is that there's no need for that. If you play it out, essentially primarily through infrastructural attack, combined with essentially terroristic means, you can drive a kind of assortative movement within society. So people flee from mixed areas to less mixed areas, which is why I directed people to look perhaps at the Balkans in the early 1990s, because that's exactly what had happened. So you get this period of assortative movement in which these groups essentially, until what finally emerges is essentially a series of zones of fundamentally three types. Zone A would be, the first zone being areas where the non-native population is concentrated and sufficiently dense and of a scale that it can physically control that territory, effectively produce what is sometimes called a no-go zone, or in Maoist terms, a stable base, you might say an ethnic enclave, but fundamentally what we're referring to is a piece of mappable, measurable physical terrain where a specific community is able to physically control it. The Zone A regions, these are pretty easy to map out. Like in the case of the UK, I would think if you start with at the Humber River and you look northward going east through west, there's a strip across the middle of the country where you'll get a series of Zone A. Probably not joined up, but a concentration of them. Another zone would be essentially the zone in which there is not much non-native population left, because you have had a period of assortative movement. The difference there in character, if you just look from a geographic and if you look at a geographic and demographic map of the country, you can see that that's some parts of some of the cities, most of the medium and smaller urban areas, and essentially all of the rural space. That's important because in terms of operations and tactics, that's a contiguous area. Those places are all joined up, whereas the first zone are basically islands. There will be a third type of zone which will not be terribly relevant, and that is the very diminished zone in which the existing state authorities are able to maintain a degree of normal, inverted commas, civil life. In the case of the UK, I think that's basically going to be some parts of metropolitan London inside the M25 where they will have the power, and perhaps some parts of the other big cities. But beyond that, I think that the state will the state potential is pretty diminished. So that then, if you think of this map of a contiguous zone with islands of non-contiguous, non-native dominated zones, then it's reasonable to expect, just from even a superficial understanding of military history, that siege comes back. That's traditionally how you deal with a contested urban space. You don't go into it, you lay siege to it. In modern terms, how do you lay siege to an area? You would do it by attacking the life support system. Where are the life support systems of contemporary cities located? Outside of the cities. Take, for example, the city of Bradford, for example. Medium-sized UK city located in the north. One of the kind of hotbeds now for these issues. How many petrol stations do you need to destroy to make fuel supply, to basically turn Bradford into a pedestrianized city, because you can't get... The answer is very low. It's probably about 25 you could do. So one could map it out. Okay, so that, I think, is a conflict which is going to be fought largely sub rosa by paramilitaries, with the state trying to maintain a certain amount of control, but ultimately over time having to bend to the larger zone.
Professor Betz, thank you very much. I'm just going to cut this bit out and saying, but we're just going to have to end the filming bit now. We can continue talking for another 20 minutes, half an hour, I think. So just edit out me saying that when you do it. But Professor Betz, thank you very much for joining us here at the Danube Institute.
Thank you.